Welcome to Grand Valley Magazine's Community in Motion film and video programs by Western Colorado's talented filmmakers. This series of short films, documentaries, and special programs showcases the dynamic life, landscape, and people of Western Colorado. Grand Valley Magazine's Community in Motion film and video programs are made possible through the generous support of our sponsors. Thank you, and enjoy the show.
Committed to preserving the arts, culture, and history in Western Colorado, Grand Junction Subaru is proud to present Legends of the Grand Mesa in partnership with Grand Valley Magazine. Grand Junction Subaru, Colorado's largest Subaru dealership west of the Rockies. The entire region was a hunting ground of the Utes, who called the Mesa Thegunawad, or home of the departed spirits. The mystic beauty of this curiously detached upland seemed to them a perfect setting for the wandering departed warriors. The Grand Mesa, so the Utes believed, was the home of 3 pairs of great eagles, known as the Baja Nietzsche, or thunderbirds, which nested along the north rim of the plateau. The white rock slides on the slope at that point were supposedly formed of bones and debris from their nests. These birds not only carried off deer and antelope, but captured Indian children as well. One day, a great Baja Nietzsche seized the son of Sehiwak, a chieftain, and carried him off to his eyrie. The father, bent on revenge, wrapped himself in the bark of the bastina, or red cedar tree, and thus disguised, started up the side of the mesa. It took Sehiwak all day to scale the mesa. Whenever a thunderbird soared over him, he stood still and pretended to be a tree. Finally, he reached the nests, pulled out the young birds, and sent them tumbling down the slopes. A large serpent, Batituba, lived near the foot of the slide, and as the eaglets rolled near him, he captured and devoured them. When the Baja Nietzsche returned to their nests and saw what happened, they suspected the serpent, carried him many miles into the air, and tore him to pieces. And as the remains fell to the ground, they formed the many lakes that we have today on the Grand Mesa.
My name is David Bailey, and I'm the Curator of History at the Museum of Western Colorado. And part of my job has always been to look into the legends and myths that surround Western Colorado.
Well, my name is C.J. Bradford. My title is Director of the Ute Indian Museum. I oversee the 8.56 acres that the museum is housed on, sharing awareness of the Ute peoples and the culture of our native people throughout Indian country.
One of the most intriguing of these myths is the legend of Thunder Mountain. Thunder Mountain is what today we call Grand Mesa.
Some names that I have heard of what Grand Mesa has been called are House of Departed Spirits and Thunder Mountain.
I first read about the legend in this WPA guide to Colorado in the 1930s. The guide talked about these giant thunderbirds and a huge serpent on Grand Mesa. Today we're going to actually travel to where these legends occurred on Grand Mesa. What's really interesting about these legends is, you hear a legend, it occurred in the San Juans or on the Uncompahgre Plateau, but this legend is very specific to a location, which makes it really interesting. I've been curator at the museum for about 22 and a half years, and over those many years, I bet 100 people have come in and asked me about the giant Thunderbird emblem on Grand Mesa. It looks like a petroglyph of a giant Thunderbird. And people say, did the native people create this big emblem on the side of the mountain because it's Thunder Mountain? But actually, it's a natural occurrence. It looks like, if you look through like Google satellite or some satellite images, it looks like natural weathering. But that doesn't mean that it didn't have an effect on the native people here.
Well, I think the happenstance is that it's a beautiful natural feature, and it actually marks an amazing spot. When you think about Palisade, and right here we're at the edge of the Grand Mesa, it's where the Rocky Mountains stop and the Colorado River leaves them and enters the Great Desert Basin. So particularly to native people, that was the thoroughfares were along the river, very special spot right here. And that natural feature obviously was a good thing for them to be able to use when they were coming from a distance. They could just use that as a site to get to the mouth of where the river cut through the canyon.
These natural processes created this huge image, which might have been pretty profound to people back then. But people say, I'm sure it was created by the native peoples, but actually it's a natural feature of the landscape, but it obviously became a cultural impact on the people that lived here hundreds of years ago.
Through the museum, I was given some wonderful stories, and one of the first ones I think I remember was Elizabeth Harris, who owns the Harris Ranch. As you come up into the town of Mesa, there's a big barn there. She said that when she was a kid, that her next door neighbors would not allow them to play with the kids next door. And years later, she ran into this woman. They were on a long train trip, and they got talking, and the woman told her, well, you know, my dad kept horses for Butch Cassidy. And the reason that we couldn't play with you kids was he was afraid that Butch Cassidy and his guys would come through wanting horses and that you would see them. So that was kind of one of the first stories that I collected on the Mesa.
Well, the Grand Mesa is prominent in southwestern Colorado for its skyline. And it was not that long ago, it was the home to many Ute bands. The Grand Mesa, of course, has its own stories that the Ute people may have their own names. For Grand Mesa, you know, it was not that long ago that the Ute bands, that was their home, where they lived, they traveled, there was, they hunted, they food gathering, a spiritual connection that they had there. They migrated, their annual migrations as well. So it was who they were.
One of the interesting things on Grand Mesa in the Whitewater Basin are these limestone plumes. The Utes believe these limestone plumes were the bones and droppings of the giant thunderbirds. We've actually, in this image, we put thunderbirds in here. But in the center of that is a limestone plume that undulates down to a little lake called Cliff Lake. And we put the serpent in there, but they believe that the giant serpent lived down around Cliff Lake right in that area. One of the interesting connections with this legend is that the Utes were connected to the Aztecs.
Well, there are many bands within the 3 Ute tribes, but the 2 Colorado tribes. And the bands up in that area would be like the White River Utes. You had your Uncompahgre Utes. But they would migrate up there following the seasons, again, for spiritual connections, food gathering, hunting. They lived up there, again, depending the time of the seasons. But that was a very important aspect to the Ute people, was with the seasons and the migration of it. And, of course, Grand Mesa held so much for them, from their doctoring, the medicines that they could gather from the many plants up there. And it was just a place that was simply, it was their home.
They both spoke the Uto-Aztecan language. So that image of the serpent and the snake is evident in Aztec history too, as evidenced by the Mexican flag of today, which has a eagle and a serpent on it. But if you notice this little picture right here, this is a temple in Mexico. And it almost mimics the Whitewater Basin, and it has 3 eagles. And this is called Malinalco. It's 70 miles south of Mexico City. But they built a temple with the eagles, and also the entrance is, over the entrance is a large serpent and it looks like one of the eagles is about to be swallowed. But it's interesting to me that the Uto-Aztecan connection is still there through their legends and culture. Even though they're 1,800 miles away, they still all came from the Great Basin in the Southwest. And they had the similar language, and also had a lot of similar legends, including the eagle, or as we call it, the thunderbird in the Ute legend.
The Mesa allowed Native Americans to kind of follow the ecozones with the summer and go up and down. So even though, you know, people say, well, they didn't live in the valley. Well, yeah, they lived in the valley, but they lived up and down from the valley to the top of the Mesa. What they're doing is they're utilizing the ecosystems and trying to create, food and shelter for themselves. So they followed the seasons up and down the Mesa, most definitely. We know that. And with the fishing and the game up there, we already know what the game hunters took out of there when they first showed up. The Utes had a much smaller impact because in this whole area, maybe only 3,000 Utes controlled most of western Colorado. 3 to 5, maybe 7 at the peak. So another thing that we don't think about is the waves of disease that came out pre-white man contact. We really don't know how thick their culture was as far as population density. I mean, people can make all kinds of guesses, but the truth of the matter is we don't know. We do know that when the whites showed up around the Denver area to mine gold, Uray was basically a sub-chief, and he went over there and looked over the edge and went, holy smokes, look at all these people, because his band was so small. And then he tried to a series of at least 3 or 4 treaties. They just kept losing land. At first they owned everything west of the divide. Then they chopped out the San Juans because of gold and silver being found. And then the Ute massacre, kind of a misnomer, it really precipitated there. It was a good excuse to get them out of here. But even up into the 1920s, there's still lots of evidence that they would come out here on hunting trips. And indeed, in the 1918 range, I think it was, they were starving to death on the reservation up there because of corruption, and they never got their supplies. And a bunch of them just left and walked all the way to South Dakota. Others came right down into Douglas Creek, and I'm sure they were down in this area.
I've been coming up here since probably like 2008. I was really interested in the Ute Thunderbird legend, and I've always been the kind of person that would actually go. I'd like to go to the site and see where it happened. And what's unique about this area is that it's site specific. The Ute legends of the Thunderbirds and the giant serpent. You can actually go to the spot where it actually happened and where the nest were for the giant Thunderbird. So I think when you get up on Grand Mesa, it's always like you're on an island unto itself. I mean, it's surrounded by desert, but when you get up there, you have beautiful lakes and vistas and wildlife and wildflowers. So it's kind of like its own paradise, and you can see why the Utes loved and had a lot of reverence for Grand Mesa, because it's such a beautiful place.
What I like to see is that we share more awareness of who we are as Indian people, but as that being in this part of Colorado, since it was Ute homelands, and it's still Ute homelands, but that we just share the awareness of that the many Utes that we have and the Ute bands that they are here in Colorado doing many things. To me, it always comes back that we still are here. Our stories still exist. We as our people, for many generations back, the stories still carry forward. The language, although language across the table with all Native tribes is not being spoken as much. We are losing a little bit of that. But we still have what I see as our identity of the Ute people, of who they are, where they come from. They have not vanished from Colorado. They have been removed from their whole larger tribal homelands to smaller areas known today as reservations, but that they still very much persist in Colorado.
You come off the desert. I know, when they were traveling, the Utes were nomadic people. And coming off the desert and coming up on the flanks of Grand Mesa and on the top, it's just like entering another world with alpine and aspen and plentiful wildlife and trout, and was a wonderful place. But also associated in their mind was not just a place of where they could get food and berries and things to eat and subsistence, but it was also a place that was sacred to them. And so these legendary Thunderbirds and what they did created awe, I'm sure, with the Ute people. I've always been kind of attracted to the myths and legends. As the director of the Western Investigation Team, we kind of have a joint project with the Colorado Mesa University where we actually, using their scientists and research laboratories and our anthropologists and historians at the museum, we can look into a lot of the Western mysteries. But another thing we look into is legends, and one legend near Grand Mesa was in Colburn, where there's supposedly a prehistoric floor. We actually excavated at the site and found a floor.
Getting back into the American Indian side of the story, Dave and I spent a lot of time just talking about rumors that we've heard, and of course we chased the stone floor, and we got a backhoe up there and dug it. It was buried under 6 feet of dirt because it was actually a tourist attraction in the 30s and in AAA magazine, and all these people would come up there just to see the stone floor. And the guy had found it because he was digging an outhouse, and he got down, he hit the floor, and he decided, well, now it'll become a root cellar until I figure out what this thing is. So he dug this root cellar, and on the floor of the root cellar he found Indian artifacts which were displayed at the liquor store in Colburn. And where they disappeared, no one knows. And what they were, there's really a few oblique descriptions. And when we went up there, the thing was actually buried under all this dirt because the previous owner had got tired of all the tourists jumping the fence and going in the root cellar, and so he just buried the thing. And Dave and I and Rick Duget went up there as part of the Western Investigations team, and we actually figured out where the floor was, dug it up, exposed it, tried to determine what we were seeing. Now, the interesting thing about that floor was it's on the same meridian as the Chaco Meridian that comes up out of Chaco Canyon. And so I think even though we took it as far as we could digging, there's a lot more to be thought about there as far as what that mystery was and how long ago were they doing that. Was it, if it was contemporaneous with Chaco, that'd be like over 1,000 years ago.
I'm almost kind of sad when I get to the end of an investigation because you're always, wow, I solved this or I didn't solve it. But yeah, I think the thrill is the ride where you're actually, doing the investigative work. And when you're looking into like the Thunderbird legend, you find text and get oral histories and anything you can find about it. A lot of cultural landscapes like Grand Mesa is 2 giant promontories, and a lot of Native American mythology has to do with twins or 2 promontories or 2 towers, or so a lot of the stories of the two hero gods, a lot of the mythology from the Mayan, the Aztec, and the Ute-Aztecan. The Utes are related to the Aztecs. The Aztecs always had twin temples of the water god and the fire god, and so Grand Mesa itself is kind of a natural cathedral for some of those beliefs. You have the twin promontories, you have this island unto itself, this kind of Shangri-La that when you come up here, people are just amazed at how wonderful a place it is. So it doesn't seem that far-fetched to me that there would be wonderful stories and legends attached to such a mystical place. Behind me is the magnificent whitewater basin where the Thunderbirds lived. You can see the giant plumes of limestone were represented in the myth as the bird droppings and bones of the creatures that the giant Thunderbirds had eaten. They had 3 large nests on the edge of the cliff up there, and then below on this flat space was actually where the serpent lived. And you can imagine in the mythology the serpent looking greedily up at the nest with the little eaglets in there, the baby Thunderbirds probably as big as a school bus. And I've heard different stories of how big the Thunderbirds were, but it seemed like they could be from 60 to 100 feet tall, which would be pretty amazing to see. But the Whitewater Basin is in a kind of a horseshoe shape, just like that temple in Mexico where they have the eagles along the edge. And it's interesting to me that it almost has the same shape as that temple constructed in Mexico in stone. But what's really interesting to me as a historian is a lot of times when you hear about a myth and legend, they say it's somewhere in the San Juans or somewhere on the Uncompahgre. But this, you can go specifically to the place where they said, the legendary occurrence happened and see it, which is amazing to me that you can look over and see the plumes, the limestone plumes, which were the bird droppings, and imagine where those great nests of Thunderbirds were. And far down below in the village, in Canna Creek was where the Ute leader lived with his son, who was captured by the giant thunderbirds. The Ute leader, Weasel Bear, and his son were camped on Canna Creek. While Weasel Bear was away, a giant thunderbird grabbed his son, took him to the nest perched above that white plume, and devoured him. Weasel Bear was angered and, dressed as the sacred cedar, climbed up the sheer cliffs, got to the nest, and rolled all the eaglets off. The eaglets rolled down to Cliff Lake and were devoured by the large serpent that lived there. When the eagles got back to their nest, they were enraged that the eaglets were gone and suspected the serpent. They flew down and grabbed the serpent and flew high above Grand Mesa. They tore the serpent apart with their talons, and the pieces of the serpent fell thousands of feet and hit the ground so hard that it created the 200 lakes on Grand Mesa.
We all have creation stories of who we are as people. There's also, besides the creation stories, talking about the Ute peoples, the 3 Ute tribes. Amongst all 3 of them, they have the Ute bear dance. And that's very much integrated into them as who they are as people, their culture. And with that comes the story of the bear dance. Well, the bear dance is held every spring, and it's held individually amongst the Ute tribes in Colorado and Utah. And that's when the bear comes out from hibernation. And with that, they celebrate with the Ute bear dance.
Another enduring legend of Whitewater Basin is the story of a lost Ute cave. It is said that the early leaders of the Ute tribe met there in secret. It's recorded in the 1940s Forest Service records that E.H. Stewart, an early Grand Mesa historian, had heard and recorded the tale and actually looked for the place in vain. As you can see by the sheer cliffs and hundreds of feet of sheer cliffs, it would almost be impossible to find the cave. Some people speculate that you dropped down through a small crevasse and went into the secret cave. But the landscape of Grand Mesa has changed dramatically over the last several hundred years. There's been a lot of landslides and a lot of changes on the edge of Grand Mesa, that perhaps the cave has been destroyed or is no longer there. But that legend persists that long ago, the Ute leaders met in Whitewater Basin at this secret cave. The story of the Thunderbirds has gone from oral tradition to printed books, and one of the best authors is Muriel Marshall, Grand Mesa's Island in the Sky, that has a unique story about the Thunderbirds in here, and it's been fun for me as a historian to see that transition from the early first recorded story in the WPA book until modern publications. A lot of travel books include the story of the Thunderbirds in their visitor information to Grand Mesa. Thousands of visitors come up to Grand Mesa each year to see the splendid scenery, but also they have a new story to take with them. A lot of travel blogs, travel magazines, and a lot of internet stories talk about the legendary Thunderbirds of Grand Mesa. So I think the internet has definitely aided in the story, and people are interested in coming to see the sites. But on the Land's End side, a lot of visitors don't know when they're over there that most of the Ute legends occurred on that side and not over on this side towards the visitor center. But I think it's kind of interesting that the internet, with all its blogs and travel logs, a lot of people always include that story, that kind of fantastic story about the Thunderbirds in their journeys across Grand Mesa into Whitewater Basin. I mean, it's an incredible scene to look down on the Grand Valley and on the Canna Creek side. And I think also when you're standing there looking down, you realize all the legendary tales that occurred around you, including the Thunderbirds, and possibly ponder where that secret Ute cave is. To the Utes, Grand Mesa was a place of legend, but also a place of life. Along the flanks of Grand Mesa, the Utes gathered elderberries, chokecherries, and buffalo berries for the winter. They also could hunt elk and deer and make it into jerky for the coming winter. Another thing the Utes would do is take acorns. They knew how to get rid of the tannic acid and make flour out of the acorns that they crushed. This narrow band along the Grand Mesa provided life for the Utes, which they appreciated coming up from the desert where life was hard with little food and only the antelope to hunt.
So one final story, and probably a last thing about the Utes. I talked about how they came back here and hunted and whatnot. And one story I've heard about is when they were rounded up in the Colburn area, there was a village site that they were hanging out at. And the government kept giving them deadlines. You got to be out of here, you got to be out of here. And they kept putting it off, and finally they were told, you guys show up tomorrow. And so they actually had a group of cavalrymen that were up on the hill watching this village, and I've been told there's a guy in Colburn that knows where that campsite was, where the military had their post, where they watched the Indians, which I think leads to the neat supposition of, well, what was their campsite? Because we've had good success using metal detectors and other techniques to really bring up some cultural stuff from these sites. You'd think there would be nothing there, but if it hasn't been disturbed too hard by cattle, you can usually come up with something. And I guess the final addendum to that is, so we know those Utes were taken out of here, but a lot of them stayed and tried to hold on and become white people in a sense. You see it in their clothing and dress. And they were able to establish homesteads and claim homesteads legally. And I heard about one couple that lived up into the 1930s up in the Mesa Colburn area. And I'm sure with a little bit of research we could come up with some names and stuff for them too.
It comes back to knowing who we are. The storytelling remains, and the same stories get passed down. However, we may have different family stories that are shared, but there are many of the central cultural stories that are passed down, and it's these stories that is of our existence.